it's Miss Carlye, and I'm here with another First Chapter Friday. Today, I have a mystery book called The Improbable Tales of Baskerville Hall. So this one's an interesting one because it's a reimagination of Arthur Conan Doyle's childhood. And if you don't know who that is, he is the author of Sherlock Holmes, the famous detective. So, in this story, he goes to a special school for gifted children where he meets a couple of professors and classmates that will later inspire the characters for his Sherlock Holmes books. Alright, so, and of course, while he's at school, there is a mystery that needs to be solved. So let's see the first chapter. It starts with a quote from Sherlock Holmes. Once you have eliminated the impossible, all that remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Right. So, chapter 1 is called A Study in Scarlet. Arthur was a boy who was almost never wrong. At school, he had the most annoying habit of working out the answers first, and getting it right too. His classmates knew that this wasn't his fault. It was simply the way his mind worked. But if you had asked Arthur Conan Doyle if something was stirring in the air that crisp September day, if he could sense adventure and danger drawing near, he would have quickly pegged you for a fortune teller, trying to trick him out of a halfpenny. Even Arthur, as it turned out, could be mistaken now and again. Is that all? He asked that fateful afternoon, frowning at the cut of mutton Mr. Fraser had set on his butcher's scale. Split 7 ways, it would barely add up to a mouthful each. I'm afraid that's all your money will buy today, Arthur, Mr. Fraser replied with a sad smile. Arthur noticed the dark circles beneath the butcher's eyes. He glanced at the far end of the sawdust-strewn shop where Mrs. Fraser usually worked, but she wasn't there. Her sight had been getting worse lately. He could tell from the way she squinted to see him when he greeted her. Perhaps it had become so bad she could no longer see well enough to work. That meant she would need a doctor, and that Mr. Fraser would have to hire someone to take her place. In other words, Arthur deduced, Mr. Fraser could no longer afford to give him a bit more than what he could pay for. Yes, sir, Arthur said, and remembering his manners, thank you. As he moved toward the door, carrying the mutton wrapped in paper, he studied the other customers waiting in line. There was a man who must have been very preoccupied, for he didn't seem to notice that he had stepped in horse manure on his way to the shop. There was a woman who had patched a tear in her skirt rather shabbily, and a boy who, judging by the bulge in his boot, was concealing a knife. Better to notice those things than the mouth-watering cuts of veal and pork behind Mr. Fraser's counter, waiting for other families to come claim them. They're not for us, Arthur told himself. Not today, at least. It was a relief when he stepped out into the sloped cobblestone streets of Edinburgh, which bustled with shoppers and paper boys, horses and girls selling posies of flowers on the corners. The air smelled of fresh ginger cakes from Beryl Clow's bakery, and was cooled by a southwestern breeze that whispered of autumn. The leaves on the few trees along the road were rattling pleasantly, waiting for their turn to fall. For young Arthur, there was usually nothing more wonderful than a September afternoon. September heralded the start of a new school year, new lessons, new subjects. Today, though, the wind brought only a chill to his heart. Before he knew where his feet were carrying him, he found himself crossing the street to W. Scott Books, where he watched a bookseller arranging her display. He couldn't make out any of the titles from this side of the glass, but the volumes were every bit as appetizing as the butcher's finest meats had been, maybe even more so. To think of all the places that lay inside of them, far away from Scotland, all the adventures waiting to be had. He let out a sigh, fogging the window with his longing. They're not for me, he reminded himself again. Not today. If his family couldn't afford enough food to fill their bellies, they certainly couldn't afford books to fill Arthur's mind. As if in agreement, the sharp rap of knuckles from the other side of the glass shook Arthur from his thoughts. The iron-haired bookseller was scowling at him from inside, gesturing for him to move along. As he stepped back onto the crowded sidewalk, Arthur came to a decision. He remembered Mr. Crabtree, the surly headmaster at Newington Academy, whose breath smelled like sour milk, telling Arthur that, with a mind as sharp as his, he could truly make something of himself in this world. But Arthur was not going to be able to test Mr. Crabtree's theory, for he had decided he would not be returning to Newington Academy next week. Someone needed to earn for the family, and with his father working less and less, that someone would have to be Arthur. The thought filled him with dread, but also determination. Perhaps he would return to the butcher's the following day and ask Mr. Fraser for a job as an apprentice. He didn't much fancy chopping cuts of meat all day, but it beat sweeping chimneys, or, he shivered, digging graves. For now, though, he was needed at home, where his mom would be waiting to make a start on supper. As he turned, Arthur nearly ran into a woman pushing a baby in a pram up the winding hill. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said. But the woman barely seemed to notice him. Strange, thought Arthur. He looked at her more closely. She was a pretty woman, but her expression was slightly pinched, as if she were in pain. Her face was a pale moon above the bright bouquet that burst from a satchel at her side, and the rich scarlet fabric of her dress. The dress stood out in the crowd of passerbyers, most of them clothed in drab shades that had half faded to gray. For an instant, the woman froze. In that same instant, Arthur put three things together. First, the woman's dress was very new. Second, the baby in the carriage was very small, no more than 2 months old. Third, the woman's breathing was very shallow. In a flash, the woman's eyes fluttered, and she tipped forward like a tea kettle. Dropping the parcel of mutton, Arthur threw his arms out as she swooned, catching her just before her head hit the pavement. Relief filled him as he awkwardly set her down. He had read the signals correctly. When she had recovered her senses from her fainting spell, this woman would be able to return home safe and sound with her baby. Her baby! Arthur's head whipped around just as the pram began to roll down the sloping sidewalk. He shot out a hand for it, but he was too late. It picked up steam as the hill steepened, moving faster and faster. His heart gave a leap as the pram jolted over an uneven stone and veered sharply toward the road, where a carriage drawn by 4 enormous horses thundered straight toward it. Okay, that is the first chapter. So, if you guys want to figure out what happens next, want to see if that baby's okay, what kind of mysteries he's going to get involved in at school, then you can call the library and ask for us to put the book aside, or you can come in and get it. It is a new book, so it'll be on our new bookshelf. Alright, so that's it for today. I hope you guys have a great Friday, and thank you for joining me.